If you introduce euthanasia to a country, there's really no natural stopping point. And so if you look at the examples set to us from other places in Canada and Europe, there really is an extreme euthanasia regime where thousands of people are euthanized every year without their consent, without ever asking for it. So what you have in Holland is a profoundly radical law where thousands of people are euthanized against their consent every year without ever asking for it. You have about 90 babies euthanized a year in Holland. And actually there's a move towards euthanizing people who aren't just at the very end of life suffering in extreme pain, but people who perhaps don't want to live anymore. Often people with depression in Holland are killed. And so what we've seen is that over the years there hasn't been the tight limits or the sharp regulations that we were promised initially. What doctors have seen time and time again is that those boundaries have been stretched so that eventually anyone who feels like they might not want to live is encouraged to end their lives with the help of the state and with the help of the doctors, often under extreme pressure and often in cases where they haven't asked for it and the state or the doctors themselves have decided that their lives are not worth living and should be ended. And so I think that's really why doctors in the UK, having seen euthanasia in Holland and Belgium, have thought that's not something that's part of medicine that we want to have. I don't feel comfortable ending my patients' lives, especially not for these reasons. This just isn't healthcare. And so that's why doctors have been so opposed to it.
And so for some people, when they think of euthanasia, they think of very hard cases in which a patient is suffering a lot. What would you say to those people who really think this might be a compassionate step for society to take?
Yes, so I completely empathise with that, and I think anyone who has a heart and who sympathises with their patients can understand why someone would feel like that they don't want to live anymore. What I would say is that if you look at all the awareness we've been doing about mental health, about suicide, about depression in the last few years, the overwhelming response to that is for us to say, let's give you the support you need. Let's not take the easy option and the cheap option out, because these things often are economically powerful. Let's not take the cheap, simple, easy option out, which is just to end that life. That's something we would never think about doing to a relative of ours if they were suffering with depression. The same is true with people who are suffering in other ways for other reasons. Let's do the hard work that we've done over the last few decades of building up palliative care, of giving people the support they need, rather than taking the easy option out, which is just to end their lives. That's not compassionate, and it's certainly not compassionate for the thousands of people affected by the law who maybe never even wanted to have their lives ended, but under these laws inevitably have their lives ended against their will. So it's not compassionate for the individual because it's the easy option out that doesn't actually address their problems, and it's certainly not compassionate for the many, many thousands of other people who would be affected by such a change.
And is there an appetite, do you think, among doctors in England or in Ireland for euthanasia? And is it in some circumstances already been practiced, even though it mightn't officially be recorded as such?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and public opinion changes a lot and the opinion of doctors changes a lot. What's really interesting, I think, is that even though most people in the UK support euthanasia or assisted suicide, and actually an increasing number of doctors, still less than half, but an increasing number of doctors support legalising assisted suicide, those professionals who are at the front lines of end-of-life care, palliative care specialists, are overwhelmingly opposed to it. So in the recent poll, where nearly half of doctors did support assisted suicide, still only 9% of palliative care specialists said that they think assisted suicide should be legal, because those are the people who work with people in these tormenting situations, and they understand that the proper medical response is to give them that support. It's not to end their lives.
Is it the case that patients are at the moment dying in extreme pain at the end of life?
So several decades ago, we made the decision that rather than introducing euthanasia, what we were going to do is really invest in palliative care services. And it's because we made that decision to invest in palliative care advances in technology and really progressive options, and refuse to simply give up on these people and basically end their lives for them. Because we made that decision, we've made immense strides in palliative care over the last few decades. Now, that's not to sugarcoat everything and not to say that there isn't still a large amount of suffering that goes on, but I think you can get a sense of what goes on by the numbers. In the UK, about 15 to 20 people every year go overseas to have their lives ended, because they really feel like their lives are not worth living. And actually, most of those people don't do that because of pain. They do it because they feel like they've lost their dignity or autonomy, things which we can actually help them with as a society just through caring and supporting them. And so 15 to 20 people from the UK have their lives ended abroad every year. It's a very, very small number, and only a small proportion of those do so because they're in extreme pain. If you compare that with what happens in countries where they have assisted suicide and euthanasia, thousands and thousands of people, only some of whom are in pain, many of whom are completely fine with their lives, they have their lives ended, often against their choice, often when they're not in any pain at all. And so even if it were the case that there are some people who can only be released from their pain by ending their lives, that's such an extremely small number. And the response of simply euthanizing thousands and thousands of people is such a grossly disproportionate and uncompassionate and mad response that it really just doesn't make sense as a response to that really difficult situation. So because we've made such huge advances in palliative care directly as a result of choosing to support people in vulnerable and difficult situations rather than simply ending their lives, we've been able to offer these patients immense leaps in technology. We have amazingly new and successful pain control. We have a comprehensive system of palliative care that doesn't just look at pain or physical symptoms, but looks at the patient as a whole and says, what are the problems they're really experiencing? If you look at people who actually undergo euthanasia or assisted suicide in other parts of the world, usually they say their problems are not pain, but they're problems like, I feel like I don't have dignity, or I feel like I'm losing my autonomy. These are problems that are actually personal problems that we can solve by loving and taking care of people and being compassionate towards people, by showing them that they have dignity even though they have illness, and by showing them that they are able to contribute to our lives in meaningful ways simply because we love them and because they're humans in relationship with us. And so what really palliative care is able to do is to address the situation in a comprehensive, loving, compassionate way that looks at the patient as a whole and addresses that individual patient's needs rather than giving up on them and saying the best option for them is to simply have their life ended for them.